Greetings and salutations. Welcome back to my YouTube channel. One thing you might have noticed if you're on the main page of the channel is that I'm going by the name of Rakish Rowan now, whereas I used to go by the name of Vidoma. The reason why I decided to make this change is because Vidoma was always my sexuality educator name, and it was something that had resonated with me for quite a while when I had come into the kink community and as I was doing my work. However, as I did start to do my gender transition, it started resonating with me a lot less, and so I decided to go by my real first name, Rowan, instead. So that's why you see the change, Rakish Rowan. What you might also notice, too, is that I haven't done a video in a while, actually since December, and I'd like to rectify this today. There's just been a lot of crazy things that have been going on since then that have always gotten in the way of me doing another video, but I'm taking back control, and I'd like to do them more often from time to time here then. So what is really resonating with me lately is wanting to talk about another sort of coming out that has been inspired by my wife, AtypicalAeshe. So, as you know, if you've been looking at her YouTube videos, she does have the challenge of borderline personality disorder, or BPD, in her life, and it's something that she is healing from and working through from day to day. And I've been inspired by how dedicated she has been to being public and open and transparent about these very real challenges that she is having. And so I wanted to come out and be open about my challenges, which are just as real, albeit a little bit different. I think all my life I have had, to some degree or level, a certain amount of anxiety and worry that has been occurring in me that has been more excessive and more intense and longer lasting and continuous, to the point of becoming almost an obsessive thought. And it's this anxiety that is something that I would like to address and actually recognize. So, a few months back, I stopped seeing my psychologist, or my therapist rather. We weren't really gelling so much, and I wanted to find someone who would mesh better with me and some of my goals. Life intervened, and I haven't been able to afford going to see another one, but at that time, when I had stopped seeing my therapist, and when she had been diagnosing me earlier, she had actually diagnosed me at the time with, I think the term was adjustment disorder. And I think that's just interesting because essentially an adjustment is when you have a large major change going on in your life, and then your emotions, your thoughts, the way you do things, the way you live day to day tries to catch up with that particular change that you do need to adjust to. Now, adjustment disorders actually occur when you've had a stressful period of change in your life. In my case, it was moving several times in the last few years, getting a divorce, getting married, my partner going through a gender change, me going through a gender change, her coming out with borderline personality disorder. So it's just these large, massive changes that have been coming into play in our lives. And I have had a hard time adjusting, so I've had, intense worry and stress about that. Now, this can take place, it can be evidenced by things like intense worry, anxiety, desperation, trouble sleeping, difficulty concentrating, lack of enjoyment. So, a lot of the markers of depression, but it's specifically because of a specific change that is very intense going on in your life. Now, I feel like I am still going through changes. We're having financial difficulties, and I'm adjusting to the idea of not having as many funds as I once had when I had a better paying full-time job. But at the same time, the more I thought about it, I'm harkening back to diagnoses I've had over the years when I've seen other therapists, and they've always been anxiety related. It's been, anxiety disorder, something non-specific, never a specific disorder, but always with anxiety or social anxiety or some form of anxiety. And it was something that I really tried to sweep under the carpet a lot. because I thought, okay, everyone has worried, everyone has anxiety, but I think what has set me apart, where I realize it genuinely is a problem, is when I've been doing some research on anxiety disorders. The Mayo Clinic website actually has some wonderful literature on their website. They're a very reputable source, so I would highly recommend them. But some of the symptoms that they mention for anxiety include feeling restless, keyed up, on edge, and from that, actually having a sense of being fatigued. Irritability, I've had a ton of irritability. Muscle tension, muscle aches, trouble sleeping. I've had digestive disorders. I also have, irritable bowel syndrome to begin with, so that might be another component of it. And just the keyed up and the intense stress and worry that I've been under. And here's the thing. In the past, I've felt very invalidated about my levels of anxiety because I feel like everyone's attitude was like, oh, everyone has worry, everyone has anxiety. Why don't you just learn to deal with it? Why don't you just get over it? It's inconveniencing us. It's making you difficult to live with. And I tried. I tried to deal with it. I tried to tamp it down. I tried to rein in my emotions. But invariably, it would continue to come up. I would have, with a lot of anxiety disorders, it is possible to have periods in your life where you're very much anxiety-free, when things are going smoothly, when things are clicking for you. But then, when I'm having such a large level of adjustment, all that anxiety has been pouring forth again. And it is requiring all my skills to be able to address those, my skills that I've learned in my Tantra work, and with meditation, and breathing exercises, that sort of thing have been coming into play. So, I think, to be honest, that my anxiety had developed very much in my childhood. I grew up in a very unusual home environment, one that was also very emotionally and personally invalidating as well. I grew up with my grandparents until about the age of 10 when my grandfather died. And my mother lived with us too. My mother is a paranoid schizophrenic who has actually been in and out of hospitals for a while and has been in a group home for the last many years at this point now. And what I saw in my household was a lot of very paranoid and very dysfunctional behavior and reactions to emotional states that were occurring. My mother's emotions could be very volatile, and I was often frightened of her because when she would go off her medications, she could be very frightening. And, she would hear voices, she would see things. She had what I would call a 1,000-yard stare that I found very unnerving as a child. And so what I found out in my household is that I was constantly walking on eggshells, having a sense of I need to be careful to caretake the adults' emotions in the house so they're not set off. My grandmother, too, I think also, she's been deceased for the last 2 years, but she has had some sort of she didn't have a diagnosis, but she has some sort of undiagnosed mental illness as well, based on some of her behavior. I wouldn't want to even hazard a guess as to what it was, because I'm not obviously a clinician or a psychotherapist, but she definitely exhibited some dysfunctional emotions. An example of some of the caretaking, aside from walking on eggshells that I'd have to do around their emotional states so as not to upset them, or make them cry or make them angry, was also that I would be put in a lot of physical caretaking situations as a child as well. For example, my grandparents owned some lakefront property in northern Wisconsin, and about 80 acres at one point, with a couple cottages. And we were up there for the summer, and I was in one cottage with my grandma, and my favorite aunt was in the other cottage. I was visiting her, and she was a diabetic who was, definitely a brittle diabetic. The littlest things would set her blood sugar levels off, and she was experiencing a moment of insulin shock. So she had too much insulin for the day, and was sort of going into a catatonic state. So I'm about 8 years old at the time. I think nothing of picking up one of those little squeeze bottles, the honey bears full of honey, and actually opening her mouth, pouring some of that in, and getting her to swallow it so that she could come out of her insulin shock, and then calling my grandmother at the other cottage to inform her what had just happened so she'd come and check on her. This is the normal thought process and putting out of fires I would do as a child. And also in that environment, I found that my emotions were very much not welcome. I recall a moment in high school. I remember my freshman and sophomore year, I was very depressed. I was dealing with a lot of very intense, ongoing depression. And I was crying. I had gone to my grandmother. I was begging her. I wanted to see a therapist, to have someone to talk to, possibly get me on some sort of medications. And I think in retrospect, it's because she didn't want me to turn out like my mother, and she was terrified of that. But she would push aside anything that she didn't want to see. I was begging and pleading, and at one point, she just said to me, "Shut up, Rowan. You are not going to be seeing a therapist. You're making me nervous. This is the end of discussion. Let's not talk about this anymore." So in that moment, what was really conveyed in that message was that my emotions, my expression of my emotions, were an inconvenience to others and something that I should not do. So I had a tendency to bottle them up, and I think that also has contributed to worry too, because I find that when I'm able to share my emotions with other people and dispel any sort of irrational fears, anxiety, or worry that I have, that my emotional levels are a lot more smoother and a lot more even. But then, if I allow myself to get back into that place where I internalize that my emotions are inconvenient to people, it doesn't go well for me. I just get increasingly more anxious and angrier, and I feel very much unheard, even though it's something I've internalized and it's something that I'm doing to myself. What I've been particularly inspired about with my wife's recovery is the sense of community that has been inherent with people with BPD. And I've been trying to analyze that, and I think what has really resonated about that analysis for me is the fact that, okay, with borderline personality disorder, you have these 9 criteria, which, a number of which all persons with BPD experience in one level or another. So even though that may manifest differently in their lives and they may have different experiences, those similarities or those commonalities of the symptoms that they do experience are pretty much across the board. Give them a sense of community and a sense of a baseline to discuss their recovery from. And I think that with things like anxiety disorders, regardless of whether it's generalized anxiety disorders, social anxiety, particular phobias, there is not a commonality of criteria for these that people experience. So there's not a sense of creating a cohesive community to discuss the anxiety. And I know that in the last 10-15 years or so, there's been a lot more made public about borderline personality disorder, people writing memoirs, Dr. Marshall Linehan creating dialectical behavior therapy for the treatment of the disorder, so that disorders like BPD, bipolar, schizophrenia, although traditionally have been very stigmatized, are starting to become more part of the public parlance. People are understanding it more. People are getting more factual information that is really leading to an open dialogue. And I think that perhaps with anxiety disorders, I'm hoping that that may be a possibility to create a community, but so far it's not wrapped around a commonality of experience yet. But, you know, as diagnostic criteria advance, as psychology, psychotherapy advances, there may be different things that are found out about anxiety disorders as well. So it leaves me thinking, I'm wondering how to create community now so that people who are experiencing anxiety can receive support. One thing I am going to do that is taking a leaf from AtypicalAeshe's BPD groups is working with the DBT. I have this actual fabulous book called the Dialectical Behavioral Therapy Workbook for Anxiety. So not only has DBT been shown to be effective for borderline personality disorder, but also some types of anxiety as well. So this is a workbook I'm starting to work through to add to my skills of mindfulness and meditation as well. And DBT, for those of you who are aware, has a mindfulness meditation sort of component. So this is right up my alley. It's something that'll I'll be able to work with, and that'll really resonate and key in for me. So what I want to get across here is that I really enjoyed having this opportunity to talk about what is so for me with my experience of anxiety, how I've been inspired by my wife, AtypicalAeshe. But I also want to reiterate rather, that this is just my experience. Everyone's experience of anxiety is a completely different creature. But it has come to my attention recently that I can't deny it anymore, that this has been something that has been here forever. I've always felt self-conscious. I've always felt like people were judging me out in public. I have frequently had worries, obsessive worries, and it's something that has affected the quality of my life and has made it very difficult for me to function sometimes from day to day, depending on the level of my anxiety. Sometimes I get paralyzed by my worries or my fears, and I'm not able to move forward. So it's something I'm recognizing, something that I'm embracing, in the sense that I'm recognizing this is real for me, but I'm also not holding it too close to my heart so that I'm defining myself by my anxiety. This is something that is a part of my experience, but is not entirely me or the entirety of my experience. So at this point, I wanted to thank everyone for listening this evening. I may be talking in other videos more about anxiety or how invalidation can be a part of anxiety. And I also would like to poll people out there to see what is a good way to create community for people with anxiety. I know that with borderline personality disorder, there's a very active Twitter community, there's a lot of online blogs for this, but to a lesser degree, anxiety. Is there a place for that? Is that something I should consider? I know I've raised a lot more questions for myself than I've gotten answers at this point, but I think I'll end here for the evening. Thank you so much for listening to me this evening, and I want you all to have a wonderful, wonderful night. Thanks so much. Bye-bye now.